My name's John Vaught. I am the immediate past president of the Colorado Bar Association and a member of the House of Delegates representing Colorado before the House of Delegates at the ABA. I wanted to take the time to address an issue that I believe is substantially important to the future of the practice law, particularly in rural America. And it's not my purpose today to make you an expert in what I'm going to call broadband infrastructure, but I do want to make you conversant with the issues that have arisen, a little bit of the history and the like, and then to talk a little about how it is that we can move forward with Congress, and with your help, we can get Congress's attention on what is an issue that, in my opinion, will make the practice of law in rural America sustainable after the middle of this century. Let me begin by identifying how this problem came to light, and I'm going to focus for the moment on Colorado, but it really is no different than most states. I did run into a delegate from an East Coast state who looked at me incredulously that we had a broadband infrastructure problem in Colorado, and my response was probably not appropriate, at least for taping, but the point is not every state has broadband infrastructure, and we estimate that about 40 states are lacking, although every state has some. All states are lacking, or 40 states are lacking and appropriate broadband infrastructure. I know the past president of the ABA is from Montana, present president is from Louisiana, and the president-elect is from Arizona, and all of them have problems very similar to Colorado. So bear with me when I relate to some of these issues on Colorado. I'll get to a much broader picture in a moment. But I wanted to tell you really how this problem came to light for me and for the Colorado Bar Association, and then eventually for the ABA. Is one of my jobs as president of the Colorado Bar last year was to get in my car and drive to every bar association in the state. We have about 29, and many of those meetings occurred in literally in bars throughout the state. I mean, if you're familiar with Colorado, Denver, Colorado Springs, the Fort Collins Greeley area, the so-called Front Range is very metropolitan, but a good part of the state is still rural, like so many. Texas has 254 counties, for example. Many of them are rural. I know Aspen and Vail would be somewhat offended if characterized as rural, but their population is transient, it is seasonal, and in May in Aspen, it is a very small town. So I set out on the road, visiting every one of those bar associations and talking, of course, to them about what were the issues they were confronting and how could the Colorado Bar Association help with the process. And I was struck almost immediately at the problems relating to communication and high-speed internet throughout the state. And just to give you an example, I found that we had lawyers driving 40 to 70 miles to get enough broadband coverage to upload a brief to the Colorado Supreme Court. Then, of course, had to turn around and drive 40 to 70 miles back. I went to Delta County, one of the prettier counties in Colorado, and we have a lot. But Delta County is the size of Rhode Island. And I found in my discussions that we were down to 22 lawyers. The youngest was 55. And we were finding that young lawyers simply would not go in there no matter what the incentive, because there wasn't enough broadband infrastructure in Delta County to support the practice of law. And we could see what was coming. And in fact I was helping the Supreme Court trying to find a judicial candidate in Jackson County, and we found there wasn't a single lawyer left in Jackson County, not the size of Rhode Island, but nonetheless, there are no lawyers in Jackson County because there isn't enough support for what I will call high-speed internet. And I use broadband and high-speed internet synonymously. Infrastructure, I'm really referring to what's the state of the art today is so-called fiber optic cable, and we're going to talk a little bit about what those terms mean. Again, not to make you an expert, but to make you conversant when you talk to these congressional delegates, because you're going to find that the staff of these delegations are really very conversant. But the bottom line was, as I looked across rural Colorado and realized that, and I'll try to explain why, rural Colorado wasn't receiving the broadband infrastructure that it needed, it really occurred to me that the eventual outcome of the loss of practice, the loss of the practice of law in rural Colorado was a loss of access to justice. And I thought that we were headed in that direction at mercurial speed. So what I realized too, as I talked to these lawyers throughout the state, is we weren't alone in that regard. It wasn't just the practice of law, although as you know, it's the American Bar Association representative, that may well be our principal focus, but education was in exactly the same circumstance. We had children driving to Walmarts at night in rural Colorado because Walmart leaves its internet on all night, its Wi-Fi on all night. And we had kids parking in the parking lots of Walmarts around Colorado to get enough broadband infrastructure or broadband coverage to do their homework. And I will just tell you about one personal experience, and you'll have this opportunity when you talk to the senators and congresspeople. I talked to Michael Bennett, who happens to be a senator from Colorado, good guy, ran for president, didn't get traction, but still good guy. And I talked to him and I said, he's got two extremely bright daughters, no doubt headed for very significant college educations somewhere in the United States. But I said to him, I said, Michael, if your two daughters had to go to Walmart at night to do their homework, you would be outraged. And he said, you bet I would. And he really has been very important, I think, to our efforts since. You know, I have a good friend up in Grand County. Again, no reason to remember any of these names. It just simply gives us a point of reference. But she opens her doors to her house at night because she has high-speed internet where she lives. And kids from Grand County drive all over the county to her home so they can do their homework. Education is in serious trouble, and we'll get to that in a minute about COVID-19. Hospitals, doctors, same way we found. And I learned quickly that, for example, a small town in Colorado named Alamosa. I mean, if you break your arm in Alamosa, you're fine. If you have pancreatic cancer, you already have to get in your car and drive to Denver to be able to get the kind of support that medical support that you need. Hospitals and doctors are really struggling. And again, we'll talk about the impact on health and human services of the current virus in a few minutes. Libraries, the same way, schools, virtual education. Again, we'll talk about the impact of COVID-19 on that, but I don't need to underscore for you that education, now that we're trying to educate every child from kindergarten through college, every child is impacted by efforts to do a virtual education with the existing broadband structure in much of rural America. And what's on the horizon? We've got 5G communication just around the corner. We got driverless cars, and we've got artificial intelligence, all of which will be impacted by the lack of broadband infrastructure. But let's go back, give you a little bit of backdrop about how this evolved. Again, not to make you an expert, but to make you understand what the problem is that we really confront when we talk to Congress and try to convince them that this is an issue they must address. I feel like I've had a iPhone, a smartphone forever, but you know, the first time that Steve Jobs stood up on a podium and held one of these up to say, look what I've invented, was 2007, which it seems to me in the digital world is not that long ago. But by, I guess, 2007 was the first time most of us were introduced at all to what a smartphone is, not to mention other devices that we have to deal with in a broadband sense. And here's the problem that we ran into. Immediately, there was a need, of course, just based on the iPhone, for broadband infrastructure to support that device and all the other devices that have evolved in a similar fashion. And the private sector, as you might address or might expect, jumped on this. And I don't mean to criticize the private sector. They're entitled to make their profit, to make their living. And in fact, as many of us, you know, have had jobs in the private sector that have paid us over time. And again, I don't mean any of it to be critical of them, but the private sector jumped on this. And there was a wave of legislation throughout the United States, Colorado and Missouri being two examples, where basically the private sector was able to secure the exclusive right to expanding broadband infrastructure throughout individual states. There's a critical difference in the way some of those legislations played out. And for example, in Missouri, when the private sector managed to get that legislature to give them exclusive rights to the broadband infrastructure, they also did not provide for what I'll call an opt-out that really turns out to be a very critical part of the legislation. Colorado had the wisdom to provide an opt-out, and here's how that opt-out works and impacts what we're doing. In Colorado, the right is exclusive to the private sector to spread broadband infrastructure. And the problem that we run into, of course, is when you say to the private sector, and I'm not going to name names, it's not my purpose to be critical, oh, we need broadband infrastructure in pick a town, Cortez, Colorado. And the private sector says, well, what's the return on investment? And you say, well, we're going to have 400 subscribers. And the private sector might well say, I'm sorry, that's just not sufficient for our needs. We're not going to put broadband infrastructure into Cortez, Colorado. And the legislation in Colorado, fortunately, and many states have the same provision, provided for the right of a county or a city to opt out of that legislation if they had an election that supported it. So for example, to pick Cortez, for example, they could opt out by a vote of the county, and if they opted out, then the county can take up paying for that infrastructure. And that's an important right, although it turns out to be absolutely insufficient for our needs, and I'll try to explain that in a minute. But what was happening in Colorado when I got involved as president of the Colorado Bar Association is, and I talked to a lot of county commissioners in the state, there were many counties and cities trying to opt out. And many have done so. I think 116 cities and counties have opted out in Colorado. But the problem then is solving the problem county by county, and we're going to find out why that's inadequate in a minute. As we moved forward in Colorado, we had some good examples of how this might work. We had some bad examples, and I'm going to tell you a little about, when I say broadband infrastructure, what that means. There is a division of broadband that's commonly used in the industry. One is called the middle mile, and I'm not going to bother with the first mile because it doesn't affect us. One's called the middle mile, and one's called the last mile. The middle mile is the result of some entrepreneurs buying up railroad lines throughout various states in the United States and then using those right-of-ways to bury what I'll call fiber optic cable, which is just what it sounds like. It is a cable capable of carrying electricity at the speed of light, if you will, and that resistance is irrelevant and the like. And that's the gold standard, if you will, for the middle mile. The critical problem for us, and Colorado still has a middle mile problem. It's so expensive to lay fiber optic cable in the mountains of Colorado, but it's still expensive in Kansas too. But the other component that we're focused on is what's called the last mile. And the last mile is connected to the middle mile cable that might well run down the main street in a small town in Colorado. And then there are various ways to connect to individual houses and businesses. But unless there is something that can handle high-speed internet, which I'll tell you the FCC defines as 25 megabytes down and 3 megabytes up, unless there's something comparable to that in terms of speed, you don't have high-speed internet in your home or in your business. We have one example in Colorado where in Fort Morgan, the state laid fiber optic cable right down Main Street in Fort Morgan, and they provided funds that closed the last mile to homes and businesses that was really at a speed approaching 1 gigabyte, which is about 40 times higher than the FCC's definition of adequate high-speed internet of 25 down and 3 up. But again, I don't mean to give you too much detail, but when the staff responds to you about certain issues, you're going to need to be conversant on that. So moving on about that, what happened was that we realized that the problem, and that's what I was preaching throughout Colorado, was county by county to say you've got to opt out, you've got to opt out, you've got to bring in high-speed internet to save the practice of law and the other professions that I talked about. And it was a very frustrating process. I got to, as a member of president of the Colorado Bar, I got to be a delegate like you, if you will, to go back for ABA days and talk to Congress a little over a year ago about, and we talked about any number of subjects, but I had the opportunity to talk to a number of people, including Senator Bennett, about the problems that we were facing and the lack of any kind of federal coordination, if you will. We had the FCC, we had the Department of Commerce, we had Department of Agriculture, who's actually doing a pretty good job. We had the Department of Transportation, we had Health and Human Services, but there was no coordination across that, across those lines. And there still is, I think, fairly miserable coordination because there is no czar, if you will, at the federal level that can dictate that. And that prior funding, again, I'm not criticizing the private sector at all about this, but the private sector has done an excellent job of petitioning for additional funds, most recently receiving, I think, about $125 million. But the problem is those grants or tax breaks or whatever are going to the private sector, not going to federal government for the purpose of developing infrastructure like we did in the development of interstate highways or development of electricity in rural America. I mean, we had many people in the 1940s and 50s arguing against the need for electricity in rural America, arguing who needs a light over every kitchen table in America. I think we now know, and I think it's obvious how important that turned out to be. But in talking to Bennett and the county by county battle I was describing, Bennett said to me, and he says, well, why don't you go big or go home? And he said, talk to the ABA and see if you guys can't take this problem of rural America's lack of broadband infrastructure to the federal level. And he said, quit trying to fight the battle in Colorado and start trying to fight the battle in rural America, you know, bless his heart. And so last year at the American Bar Association meeting in San Francisco, that's exactly what we did. The CBA, Colorado Bar, with a lot of help from representatives of the American Bar Association, developed a resolution, and we went to the House of Delegates and we said, we've got to argue for Congress to take charge of broadband infrastructure in rural America, or we're going to lose all of these professions, including the profession of law. And we presented it to the House of Delegates, and bless their hearts, other than those who abstained, it was unanimously supported. And with that, we have the backing of the ABA to go to Congress, which is exactly why we're in this situation now. And the ABA has backed us up in saying that we need a rural support in much of America, and that the FCC's definition of 25 megabytes down and 3 up is simply inadequate. It certainly works for Netflix, but it's not going to work for a sophisticated communication system based on high-speed internet for the next century. And so the ABA supported our position of 100 megabytes down and 30 megabytes up. Again, I don't want you to try to memorize all of these kind of details, but understand what it is we're trying to do. Again, remembering that the gold standard is really 1 gigabyte, which is 40 times higher than the FCC's definition. So it's going to take money, and it's going to take a lot of money. So after we got that resolution, one of the representatives from the ABA invited me, and we went to see all the Congress people in the delegation from Colorado, much as you'll be doing for your particular delegation. We showed them the ABA resolution. We talked to them about the problem, and we got something short of unanimous support, but we got, I thought, very strong support from many in our delegation about how important this is to take this to Congress and get the money to really take charge of this and treat it just as we did with interstate highways and electricity. And that is exactly what it is that we have tried to do, is to obtain that money. And I searched the Colorado delegation for somebody who would support that resolution for us. It's an appropriation resolution. I think we could throw out numbers. I'll tell you they start with a B, but I have information from the Southwest Council of Government in Colorado, but we don't know if it's really accurate, and having a precise number may not be that important. But I can tell you now, just so you have some sense of what you're going to walk into, when you sit down in the office of the senator from your state, his staff person who is designated to be an expert on broadband may ask questions that really are difficult to answer, because often they will inquire of me, what's the nut, as they like to put it, wanting to press me on a number. We have decided not really to give a number at this point, but as you can imagine, with 40 states who need broadband infrastructure, it is a big number. We're confident into the Bs. But we need the federal government to appoint representatives to create coordination between the various departments, so we don't continue to do this on an ad hoc basis. So you're going to be going into your delegate's office, may talk to the senator from Alabama or the senator from Montana, congressperson or whatever. And, you know, again, you can expect, I think, that you're going to find a fairly educated group about this issue, even though I think at the federal level, it is, you know, less than desirable, if you will. But no doubt staff has paid attention to this. They'll be familiar with prior legislation, which has generated money, but is not generated money that starts with a B, for example. But you should expect, I mean, that one of the questions that will be asked of you is whether it's some variation of what's the nut. They're going to ask you about money. Again, I think that we simply acknowledge it's a big number, rather than try to give them a precise number. Also, you're going to hear, particularly from the more conservative members, of why in the world should the United States government invest in infrastructure? Why isn't this best handled by the private sector? I think the answer is simply that the private sector understandably has tried to control this for their benefit. Again, I don't mean that to be critical. And they are perfectly happy to keep this issue at a county level rather than a national level, because they in fact are in charge of when infrastructure goes in and when infrastructure doesn't go in. I'm not trying to take that away entirely from the private sector, because there is no question we need a partnership with the private sector to make this go. Just like the United States did not get in the transportation business when it built the interstate highway system, it turned it over to the private sector for use. But I think one of the responses that you want to give to a representative who says, why should we be involved, is to cite to those historical examples that I have mentioned. And that I will tell you, Colorado did a study, and I have no reason to believe it's inaccurate, but at the same time, I don't have any firm basis to say it is, but I think it's a fair guess. And they anticipate that the state investment in broadband infrastructure in Colorado will return 12 times the return on investment. I quite frankly think that's conservative. I think that we can, again, look to the interstate highway system and say, you know, you didn't get in the transportation business, and look at the return on investment that you got from the interstate highway system. Our economy has prospered incredibly so from that. You know, I think the other questions might vary, and you just have to have a little bit of understanding of what's the problem in your state. But here's why I think this is a particularly good time to talk to Congress, and that's because of the COVID crisis that we're facing. And if Congress isn't out of money right now, I don't understand the federal budget system, but that's a negative. But on the other hand, my goodness, we couldn't have more real examples of the impact of the lack of high-speed internet in public health with COVID-19. Hospitals are desperate for high-speed broadband coverage. Education, like I said before, we are trying to educate today every student in the United States from kindergarten through graduation from college and postgraduate school. We're trying to educate them right now on a virtual basis, and we're finding out just how inadequate the speeds are that are available to them. And I think that I don't care who you talk to, conservative or progressive or however you want to describe them, everybody can at least appreciate the problem now. I think there might have been some denial in the past. I think that denial is behind them. It's something within our grasp. I will tell you, I think it's also to our advantage, because I thought some of the numbers that were thrown around in support of broadband infrastructure and what it was going to take to fix that in 40 states seemed like huge numbers to me. Now we're having numbers thrown around in the trillions. And again, I don't want to pick on anybody, but I mean, when there are restaurant chains that can receive millions of dollars, I don't think there's any doubt that we can somehow afford to do this, if for no other reason, for our children and for the education of those children. And so I think this is a particularly good time. In your presentation, and I think somebody needs to be designated to present that when the opportunity comes, when you're in your senator's office or so on, or whatever, and everybody should chime in, but somebody should be designated to carry the ball on broadband infrastructure. And I am available to talk to anybody by text or email or cell phone or whatever to help support you in that. But you know, from the ABA's perspective, I'm going to repeat that we feel that the practice of law is not sustainable past the middle of the century if we don't get broadband infrastructure brought into most of the rural states in Colorado. But well beyond the practice of law, we're also concerned, of course, about health and human services. We're concerned about public safety. We're concerned about education at every level. And the keys are, I think, that it isn't just that lawyers are going to be out of business in rural Colorado, but with the demise of the practice of law in rural Colorado, we lose access to justice. And that really is so fundamental to our mission at the ABA or the CBA or the Denver Bar Association. Providing access to justice to our citizens is really as important as it can be for us. But again, as I say, we're not alone in that regard, and don't forget that. But I think we've got to emphasize to these congresspeople and senators that we're talking about something as fundamental as access to justice in the United States. I think another key is an opportunity to promote the importance of economic development, because I don't need to tell you that it feels like our economy has come to a complete stop. And we're going to have to start that process of restarting the engines, if you will, and moving on down the road on this economy. And high-speed internet is going to be so important, because I think America has changed in a way as a result of COVID-19 that may never go back. I mean, many people have discovered they, in fact, can work from home. Many have discovered they, in fact, can work remotely. Education, it may well involve internet access and virtual education for a long time to come, and maybe forever. We also have got 5G, we've got artificial intelligence. All of those things require broadband infrastructure, high-speed internet, if you will. The bottom line is, I think COVID-19 has brought to us a new reality about what the future holds, and I think it's going to be critical that we be able to support that at a level that really will return its investment many, many times over. So I wish you the best. If I can help you with it, I urge you to contact me. But again, I think there's nothing more important than our future, and you have the opportunity to advocate for that right now. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to help any other way I can. Thank you.